Hey everyone, and welcome to video 4 for chapter 24, the final video for chapter 24, where I'm going to be talking to you guys about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Now, Europe went through a lot of changes during this period. You know, the 15th, 16th centuries, that's kind of like the overall theme that we've had throughout the entire chapter. But during this time, they also saw a tremendous amount of innovation in areas that, for previous centuries, have been dominated by Arab, Indian, and Chinese scholars, namely math and astronomy. You know, European scholars during this time, they began to reject the religious dogma and rely on observation. Now, observation was nothing really completely new to European scholarship. You know, that goes back to the classic Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So that kind of stays in line with the theme of the Renaissance, a kind of resurgence of classical learning. So observation and rational thought and logic, that starts to make a comeback. But math was not a big thing during the Dark Ages. That was something that really kind of took off, particularly in Indian and Arab scholarship. But that starts to make its way into Europe as well. And they were using these things, observation and math, to figure out new models of the universe. Also, they began to take similar type of approaches in questioning old social and political norms. And we'll talk about this with the Enlightenment. Now, much of the buildup to what we call the scientific revolution was about these new models of the universe. Up until the 17th century, Europeans based their understanding of the universe on what we call the Ptolemaic model. Now, this model, developed by the Greek scholar Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE, positioned the Earth at the center of the universe. Okay, it's also what we call a geocentric model of the universe. It also believed that the heavenly bodies, such as the moon and the planets and the sun, were perfectly smooth, right? They were perfect spheres, and their orbits were perfect circles. This model worked well with Christian dogma, since God's greatest creation, us, we were on Earth, and Earth was at the center of everything. And it also figures that the heavens, which is God's domain, were perfect, right? And everything up in the heavens were perfect also. What this model didn't work with well, though, was what, even early astronomers in Europe were starting to figure out, that what we're looking at what the planets are doing doesn't really vibe well with perfect circles. Even, they looked at what these... blank there for a second. These things called epicycles, okay? If you look at what the planets are doing, they don't just go in perfect circles across the sky. Sometimes they'll go a little faster, sometimes they'll go a little slower, sometimes it looks like they even go back. And these are called, the medieval astronomers, they tried to kind of rectify this by coming up with this concept known as epicycles. And they said, oh yeah, they kind of do like these figure 8 things, and they just do twirls, and then they eventually get back into their circle. Didn't really make a lot of sense, but it was the best they could do to rectify the old notion of perfect circles and what they were observing. Now, the changes, though, that nobody was able to, really dispute anymore, that really kind of came first and foremost from this Polish astronomer, Nicholas Copernicus. Now, Copernicus argued that the sun was at the center of the universe. Now, there's Nicholas. This model worked well with observational data. However, it was not accepted well since it challenged religious beliefs. It implied that humans were not the center of creation. Right? How could that be true if we were created in God's image? We have to be at the center of everything. Even though it was unpopular in powerful circles, Copernicus' theory still inspired later astronomers and thinkers, and this led to the scientific revolution. Now, Europeans began to rely more on observational data, which became more possible with technological advances. The most prominent of these new scientists was an Italian astronomer named Galileo Galilei. Galileo built on the work of Copernicus and another guy, Johann Kepler, who demonstrated that planetary orbits are not perfect circles, to fully disprove Ptolemy's model. Galileo, he used a relatively new invention. There's a picture of Galileo called the telescope. There's a picture of actually Galileo's telescope, which is in a museum in Italy. And he used the telescope to show that the heavens were not perfect, right? He saw blemishes on the moon. He discovered unknown moons of other planets and even posited that stars were a lot farther than originally thought. He also did a lot of early work on the laws of motion. He would put experiments, and he says it's not about the actual weight that determines, whole kind of distance and everything like that. It's about the height that you throw it from. You would take a heavy object and a lighter object, and he would drop them and show that they both would land at the same time rather. And now these experiments went against the laws of Aristotle, who was the most revered of the classical philosophers. However, they were also more fully formed by an English mathematician known as Isaac Newton. He used observation and math to formulate a series of laws that connected simple movements on Earth to the movements of the planets and the stars. Right? We have our 3 laws of motion according to Newton. Objects at rest remain at rest, and objects in motion unless something changes them. Force equals mass times acceleration. For every action, equal and opposite reaction. You guys will kind of learn about all this stuff more in physics. He's most famously associated, though, with his law of universal gravitation. He said the same source that made the apple fall on his head makes the earth move around the sun. Now, men like Newton, and especially Galileo, who was formally condemned by the church, they met significant resistance to their findings. But the spirit of questioning and innovation would only gain steam in further decades. Now, changing from science to more philosophy, we get into the Enlightenment. The spirit of questioning that was established in Europe with the Renaissance, it carried over into the scientific revolution, and now we're looking at it, less about kind of the role of man in the universe, and now just how we fit within society, how we fit within governments. In the Enlightenment, it was a 17th and 18th century movement, mostly in cities such as Paris and London, that examined things such as natural laws and the use of reason. It argued that there are laws inherent to all humans, and governments can't take that away, which was a very revolutionary concept at that time. You go back to ancient times, and kings and governments were able to do whatever they wanted because they got their right to rule not from the people, but from the gods, if you're going back thousands of years, or God in Christian dogma. And reason as opposed to blind faith. Right? Blind faith worked better for absolute monarchs. God made me the king or the emperor. Shut up and do what you're told. But to use reason and logic, that could be a problem. It was the same concept as that of observation in science, but now applied to society. Now, these views were postulated by a group of people known as the philosophes, which is a French term for philosophers. Some of the most prominent of them were John Locke. He was an English philosopher. He attacked the divine right of kings and his views on the consent of the government. That government gets the right to rule from the governed, not from any higher power or God. They would become the basis for the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson would sit down and write it a couple of decades later. Another guy was this French guy, Baron de Montesquieu. He was a French nobleman who advocated for a government with different branches of power. So, power could be separated and not consolidated in one person. Again, you see the influence of him early on the creation of our American government. But the one who probably epitomized the spirit of the Enlightenment the most was the French writer Voltaire. Voltaire was a champion of civil liberties, especially freedom of speech. You see the quote there. I might disagree with your opinion, but I'm willing to give my life for your right to express it. He also frequently attacked institutions of power such as the monarchy, and the Catholic Church was a favorite target of his. He also was an example of a new way of viewing religion called deism. Deism is very similar to the modern-day concept of agnosticism. It believes in the existence of God, but denied the specific faith-based beliefs of Christianity, such as Jesus' virgin birth or his resurrection, the miracles, and so forth. Deism, it falls in line with the scientific revolution and Enlightenment in that it rests on observation and reason and cannot accept supernatural or unexplainable phenomena. Okay, so that wraps it up for talking about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Also wraps it up on chapter 24.